In this video, we'll be taking a closer look at a god whose name I could not find a proper pronunciation for online because there are so many different ones. I'll just say Izanami now, and I guess you'll have to deal with it. More specifically, we're gonna look at how Izanami's very unique basic attacks interact with different items. We're gonna look at various unique interactions in the video and then come to a conclusion on how to make a full build out of the knowledge that we've gathered. Starting off, we're looking at Lifesteal. Originally, I thought that Lifesteal would be very good on Izanami simply because she can hit so many targets at once in a single basic attack. I knew that the Lifesteal value was gonna be decreased to some extent, but I didn't know how much. Now I know. Her basic attacks are actually considered AoE attacks, which kinda makes sense because they are. So they have the same lifesteal that most mages have on their ability, which is 33%. Now, if you've ever played a mage with lifesteal or you've played Bakasura and used lifesteal into ultimate, you will have noticed that this is not very much. In fact, the value is so bad that most people recommend against building lifesteal on Bakasura and on mages, with some exceptions, or sometimes build it late game for the power on the item and the lifesteal is just a nice bonus effect. But you will hardly ever see a mage or Bakasura going into lifesteal early and still be effective as he would be with normal items. Now, for hunters, the situation is generally a bit different. You have to consider why you're building something. And for hunters, it's not only to have more trade potential, but also to sustain in lane on their own longer. Which is kind of important because you can't bag as easily as a mage in middle lane. In an early trade, the advantage of lifesteal is not very much given. If you have a higher damage item over an enemy hunter that has more lifesteal, you're most likely gonna win the trade regardless, because the lifesteal is just not gonna be enough in terms of value in return to what you get for it. Who cares if you steal 10 health from your enemy if your enemy deals 20 more damage than you with every single hit? This only changes very, very late into the game when you have high crit damage and lifesteal values are actually significant. What the lifesteal is actually used for is out of combat, or rather out of trades healing. When you're not directly boxing your opponent, you're gonna try and heal up on the minion wave, and the healing done here is very significant because basically every single hit on a minion will heal you by a decent amount. While Izanami clears waves extremely fast, she's not gonna heal much from a wave, and that takes away the main value of lifesteal early in the game. Izanami has relatively good trading potential relatively early in the game anyways, between the steroid on her 1 and the high damage on her ultimate and her 2 with high damage and a slow, so she's not really reliant on having something extra for trades, but she will need that extra sustain. She also has high clear, so that's not an issue for her either, and she doesn't use too much mana while clearing either. So all in all, what I would recommend if you're playing Izanami is either going for Death Toll, as only procs once per basic attack, but it's still some sustain, or stocking up on potions a little more. Potions, I feel, are often very underrated because they can really allow you to stay in lane longer, and if you don't have to invest into a lifesteal item and you go straight into other items, it's very affordable to just get some health potions in between. We look at how a full build in that context could look at the end of the video. We're going to address some more points beforehand that also impact on how this build should be structured. What's important to note about Izanami's basic attacks is that every hit only procs an item once. This is crucial in regards to those items that have on-hit effects, because you're not actually going to get multiplied effects. So for example, if you use Sais, you're not going to get 2 procs in one basic attack because it hits 2 times. This makes for a lot less mechanics that can be abused, and I think that's a good thing. However, there are still some that work in our favor. One of them actually is Sais. While Sais can only proc once per basic, as on every other hunter, it still is beneficial because you don't need to connect both of your hits in order to proc it. If you just connect the first hit, you will already apply the full damage of Sais. You can see that in this video here, where the 20 damage applies immediately. When I use Izanami steroid, the damage from Sais stays 20, it's still the same value. There's another number that pops up now, but that's not actually Sais, that's the additional damage from her 1. So even if your enemy is able to juke the second part of your basic attack, Sais will already have done its damage. So In that way, it amplifies your initial damage on the shuriken going through the target, which is very helpful, especially for early trading. With that out of the way, let's dig into crit a little further. First, I want to debunk a rumor. People have claimed that Izanami can only crit on one way of her basic, so her basic attacks can't double crit. That is not true, as you can see in this clip here, where I throw my basic attack and it crits on the way towards the enemy and back from the enemy. So in a way, Izanami has two chances to proc a crit on a single basic attack. Take this with a grain of salt, simply because if you crit on one way and not on the way back or the other way around, then the crit will deal less damage than a single crit from another hunter would have dealt if he crit a single time. So the damage is not actually increased compared to any other hunter when talking about crit. Izanami's interactions with crit are especially weird when it comes to the second part of the hit. If you crit on the second part of the hit only, then on-hit effects that would apply a passive like Wind Demon or Poison Star will actually not apply. You see that right here. I crit, but nothing happens. My passive doesn't show up, even though I have Wind Demon and I was able to proc it before. It is, however, possible to proc a crit on-hit effect if the first part of your hit didn't connect. If you throw out your weapon and it comes back and only then connects to a target, then an on-hit effect can be applied, as you can see with the malice here. Here's the proof that it doesn't work if the first hit already connected and only the second hit crits. This doesn't only count for guard, the same goes when fighting against minions, as you can see here, where I crit on the way back of hitting my basic attack and it doesn't actually trigger the Wind Demon passive. At the same time, you can see here that I hit my crit on the first throw of my second basic attack and it immediately activates the Wind Demon passive. So despite of not having an almost certain chance to trigger your passive, you still have a relatively high chance of doing so by hitting a wave before a fight, having that passive and then going into the fight. It usually shouldn't take more than 2 hits because you have 6 times the chance of any other hunter to do so. Talking about things that have a higher chance, here's one that doesn't. Odysseus' bow procs exactly as often as it would if you hit a single target instead. The only advantage here is that it interacts the same way as crit, so if you didn't connect the first part of your hit and you only connect the second part, Odysseus' bow will still proc. So even if you only deal half of the damage with either the first part of the hit or the second part, Odysseus' bow will still deal the full bounce damage. An especially interesting interaction is that of Rage. Rage would typically lose a stack as soon as you crit. However, as you can see here, it actually doesn't lose stacks if you crit on the second part of your basic attack. As with every other on-hit effect, Rage only gets 1 stack per basic attack, so on both bounces you get 1 stack in total. However, if the stack isn't consumed if you crit on the second hit, that means that realistically you will have more crits than other hunters on average. It's not the hugest increase, but it's a solid increase in regards to crit chance and what you can do with it. The only exception to the rule here is Deathbringer. Apparently, Deathbringer's passive is not considered an on-hit effect, as it's simply added to a crit, so even if you hit on the second part of your basic attack, you will still get the full Deathbringer extra damage. All additional amplifiers are factored into the same extent as well, so while my normal basic did 207 damage each, the steroid damage does 414, so it's actually just exactly half the damage and you're not losing anything. What does this mean in regards to crit items overall? Rage is probably extremely good because you can make better use of it than any other hunter. Wind Demon is also relatively good because you can proc the passive relatively reliable on a wave and then go in and fight. Poison Star does have no actual advantages for her, and I would probably not recommend building it unless you want to make sure to confirm your basics more, but the other crit items just have better interactions with her basic attacks. When it comes down to Malice versus Deathbringer, it's really a bit of a gamble simply because Malice is more effective if you hit and crit more often on the first strike, but if it crits on the second strike it's less effective, so that's kind of What we can say here for sure is that the burst damage of Izanami gets extremely scary if you have some heavy crits in there, and she often wants to box with her one active. So in that regard, Deathbringer is probably better. Also, because Deathbringer works better if you already have other crit items, which should be given because both Wind Demon and Rage are so good that at least one of them should be in your build if you want to build into a high damage crit item as well. Last but not least, I wanted to talk about Izanami's abilities and her passive. In her passive, she gets extra penetration for how low her health is. This is nice, you should not purely rely on this, but it's something to keep in mind when it comes to which penetration items you want. The problem with Executioner is that it's damage reduction, so in that regard, penetration makes less sense, as damage reduction and penetration have a really bad interaction, as I already pointed out with Titan's Bane. So in terms of synergy, Titan's Bane is probably a lot more synergistic for her as it works with her passive. DPS wise, Executioner always has the advantage of having additional attack speed, so that should be kept in mind. Also, apparently, I've heard this and I cannot confirm it and I didn't have the chance to test it, Executioner only procs on the first target you hit when using your basic attacks in the normal way. If this is the case, that makes Titan's Bane a lot better as soon as you're fighting against more than one target, as then you will be able to apply that bonus damage via penetration to all of the targets and not just one. Then there's also something relatively crucial about her abilities. Spectral Projection not only has relatively high base damage, it also has 90% scaling, which is not the highest scaling but a very high scaling for such an easy to hit ability. And Dark Portal even has 120% scaling. This means Izanami scales very well with high power and has a lot of damage she can apply before even applying penetration via basics. On top of that, Sickle Storm is one of the best attack speed steroids in the game, so she is not as reliant on extra attack speed items simply because she can get so much attack speed out of her one already that she may not be needing that much more compared to other hunters. That overall makes me think that Titan's Bane will often be the better choice for her, simply because it's just so much more that it's offered that's synergistic with her kit compared to Executioner, which I generally would prefer on other hunters. In the same sense, due to these high power scalings, especially early to mid game, Transcendence is, in my opinion, a very good choice on her. It offers you the option to get some more health potions early along with it, and it will give you that power burst that you need in order to be a proper lane bully, have fast clear, and be able to use your kit as effective as possible. So with all the information we have now, we can actually do a build for Izanami. Here is what I think is a very beneficial build for Izanami depending on the situation and so on. Obviously coming with some situationals as all my extensive builds, and I'll go over it once more to explain the context. So we have Transcendence for the early power spike that allows you to have a lot more ability damage and all that stuff as just explained. You have a potential death toll that you can fit in but don't have to, simply because it gives you some extra sustain as the build otherwise doesn't have lifesteal. If you don't feel confident without lifesteal, then throw that death toll in there. If you absolutely don't like Transcendence, you can also just start with death toll and go right into boots, or rather go into short bow to get Ickvale and then go into boots. Then you want power boots just to abuse that ability damage a little more. You can trade them out for attack speed boots late game as always. This is just the standard these days. Next you're building Ickvale, or it is apparently correctly pronounced Ickvale. This item gives you some attack speed, which you will need. It gives you some penetration, which you will definitely need. And it will also offer you some extra power for your abilities and a lot more trading potential, which is especially important considering that the enemy will have lifesteal and you need something else to compensate for that when it comes to boxing. After that, you're going into Sais, which gives you a lot more boxing potential and obviously has the already mentioned benefit of proccing on the first part of the hit already, so even if only half of the hit connects, you still have full damage, which is really nice in boxing scenarios. After that, it is a matter of preference. I would personally recommend Titan's Bane most of the time, simply because the interactions with her kit and the abilities are so strong, and you'll often use abilities before the fight even begins, before you even hit enough basics on your enemy to make Executioner worthwhile, and the other interactions that I mentioned before. You can obviously still go Executioner. The obvious benefit here is that it has some more attack speed. After that, it's once again up to you. I would prefer Wind Demon here most of the time, I think, simply because that extra passive is so nice, because it can proc so easy on waves, and at this point you may actually end up being in waves a little more still. But in the end, it's more about which stage of the game you're in. If you're still looking for 1v1 trades from time to time, or you need to get out of situations a lot, then I would recommend Wind Demon, especially because the other benefit here is that you have some extra attack speed that you're missing out from not going Executioner if you choose Titan's Bane. However, the additional benefit of Rage with the return crit not taking the passive is obviously very nice. In my opinion, it makes more sense when you already have another crit item. After that, you want to trade out Ikaival, either for one of the 2 crit items from mentioned before that you didn't build yet, or Deathbringer, because it's just so beneficial. And you can also consider Malice here, obviously, if you want to gamble on that first hit crit. Other than that, you can always trade out Transcendence late game for a situational item, as you're not that mana dependent anymore. Bloodforge is really potent here, and it gives you that lifesteal that you may actually need at this point of the game, where your power is efficient enough to even get some healing out of the slight margin of lifesteal that you have compared to normal lifesteal. Also, you'll be trading with your steroid up a lot more, so you'll have the full lifesteal more often than early on in the game. You can also trade it out for Malice if you want to go for more basic attack focus. However, your ability damage will actually be lower than if you keep Transcendence, which is something to keep in mind when you have an ability that has 120% scaling. This mostly depends on how much you want to focus on your abilities or on your basic attacks. This video ended up being a lot more in-depth than I thought it would be, but well, so be it. Thank you guys for watching. Hope to see you next time. I make new videos daily. Duke Sloth, out.